Well, John, I want to talk a little bit about a philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, and what he might tell us about dealing with some of our deepest problems in life, especially what I'll call now the problem of futility or hopelessness, which many people feel. I know you've had an interest in Whitehead, and I think you've really absorbed a lot of his thought. That's a good word. Whitehead likes that word absorb, and I think you have done that. And Whitehead has really shaped a lot of your own religious outlook, hasn't he?
Very much so.
You know, there are not many Catholic priests who would say that. In fact, you're the only one I know
I think there's a few others.
I know of no other Catholic priests who would say that their spirituality is really shaped by Whitehead as much as yours is. Do you want to tell me a little bit about how that happened, or?
Well, I think it is, as I mentioned once before, it's got to do with my science background. And I think it's got to do with my sense of to me, the most important thing in life is awe, wonder. There's Abraham Heschel has a book. Yeah. I brought it from the very title.
Yeah.
I asked for wonder. And to me, I think our whole sense of worship, standing before God, has to have that sense of awe and wonder. And the only way that can be is if somehow or other we touch that God that is there. If he is so totally other from us, it is difficult for us to say, well, where is this that I'm standing before? Who is this one that calls me to awe? And I think Whitehead is the topic we're going to get on, the compassion, the call, the lure, the whole thing, is a God who is calling us, drawing us, who is showing us who he is and calling us to what perhaps we never thought we could be. Mm-hmm. Always inviting us beyond. Mm-hmm. I think there is a tendency, to me sin is the moving away from that, is saying I will not to the invitation. And the Lord is always saying to us that you are my son, this day I have begotten you, in a sense, and calling us to be that.
And Whitehead has resonated with you. I think that's what often happens with a philosopher or theologian as we study them. They resonate, meaning the way they speak and the categories they use make sense to us. When we hear them, we say, oh yeah, they've said clearly what I felt vaguely. I mean, that's what Karl Rahner has done for me. I mean, I read Rahner's philosophy and theology and I get excited. I mean, it makes immediate sense. I say, I know how I would apply that to my life and how it would help me in my preaching. And I think for some people, it's true, Whitehead has done that. In fact, while I sort of play down there's as many Catholic priests that influenced by Whitehead, there's a whole school of thought that we call process philosophy and process theology that has resulted from Whitehead's thought. You have to remember, we're talking Alfred North Whitehead, we're talking about a man only late in his life who wrote important books about religion. Up till then he wrote about mathematics and lectured in the sciences, and now only in his 60s did he write these books on religion, but they were so powerful. I mean, some theologians say that, he was the most important seminal thinker of the 20th century, that he spawned a whole school of thought that sort of is fundamentally has the notion that the world is evolving, that we are changing, and that God is immersed in this world, part of it, and is close to us in the process. So Whitehead has talked about his philosophy as a philosophy of organism, meaning we're connected in with one another, or it's a process kind of theology, which means that God is changing and responding to the world and as he directs it and shapes it as well. So, I mean, this little thumbnail sketch, I mean, Whitehead was really born in England and taught at Cambridge and came to the United States at the age of 63, taught at Harvard, and died in the late 1940s, just to locate him a bit. But let me go back to what I suggested I wanted to talk to you about, John, and that is the problem of futility in life, the sense maybe that what I am about doesn't mean anything, that it's not worthwhile, that the question of really in a world that is so complex and changing and fraught with difficulties, can we have any hope? Is there any hope that it's going to get better? Can we deal with our drug problem? Can we handle the threat of terrorism and the nuclear threat? I mean, it's just so complex. And I think a lot of times people feel that futility. And they feel it at a personal level, like, geez, I tried so hard to raise these kids, and now they're not responsive, and don't appreciate what I've done. I've tried so hard to reform my parish and make it better, and I don't see it revitalized in any real sense. I mean, across the board, you can say, what's it all mean, and where is it going, and is there any sense to it? So I think that, that is a real existential problem for people today.
And I think one of the terms that Whitehead uses, the great companion, is very important, because for me it says this. Sometimes we say, is there any reason to keep going? And Whitehead would say to us, God never gives up. Why should you? Mm-hmm. And so we always have that sense of, I'm not in this alone, that I'm actually being asked to cooperate. That's a wonderful idea, to say to someone, you are being asked to cooperate, to work with, to see the vision of God in this particular, not just in some general area which is out in the world which hasn't got anything to do with reality, but in this particular mess that we see in which we want to quit, to actually hear God say to me, here are the possibilities. This is where I call you. And he's not calling me out of something which says, do this which is impossible. But he's calling us to what is possible. And he is always doing that. I think that's the great thing to me about, someone once talked to me about God punishing. And it actually in Whitehead's thought, the punishment of God is the conversion that God brings about, if you want to speak that way. Mm-hmm. That what God is about is transformation, rather than God is going to get you. God sees our brokenness and says, I will transform this with you, but never alone, with you. And that to me is always what empowers me, that I'm with God, and it is God doing it and inviting me to be part.
God, as you said, is the great companion, is one of Whitehead's images of God, the great companion who walks the path with us and opens up new possibilities. And he does what you were saying so beautifully, John, in many ways. One way is by building a creative impulse into the world itself. So Whitehead would say it's God who has put the Spirit into the world so that it evolves in the direction that it's gone in. Mm-hmm. God has given the world possibilities to move from inorganic matter to life forms and eventually to human forms as we know it today. God is within that process and drawing it, alluring it forward into the future, into always something better. So his philosophy is that the world is made up of energy events. And each one of these energy events sort of captures what's gone before it, but then reshapes it, reforms it, and opens it up to some new form, and creates something new. So that's very abstract, and I suppose it only becomes real when we think of ourselves. That's probably the way we can get a feel for what Whitehead is saying here about process. But he would say that we humans absorb what has gone before us. We absorb the progress our parents made, and then we shape it in various ways, and we hand it on. Maybe we could get it this way. I mean, a lot of us were given educational opportunities because of the sacrifices of our parents. They moved forward. They got a little more education than their parents did, and then they gave us a new kind of opportunity and maybe made us study and said it was important to go to college and so on, created an atmosphere, and then we have to take that and hand it on in some way to the next generation. So there is an actual growing process here of expanding consciousness, of trying to develop the world and to move it forward. So that's one way in which God acts in the world, by giving a creative impulse into the whole of reality, and especially into the human heart.
And I think in the terms of the brokenness and the futility, I would like to relate an experience that happened in Africa. First of all, I have to put a little background in that, Whitehead's the great companion. He's just not somebody who's looking over our shoulder, but in process, philosophy, and theology, he's involved.
There's God. God is involved.
God is involved, and God takes that experience into himself, so that, as he would say, that he feels in the apprehension of God, as he takes that into, he feels what we feel. And it's not just God looking at our brokenness and being outside of it, as a doctor looking at someone who is sick and saying, well, this is what you're doing, but actually experiencing with us in that quantization of his experience how we are, and then in knowing that, offering us these new options, calling us out of that. There was a man who had his family had been killed by the soldiers. His wife...
Now we're in South Africa.
In South Africa. Yeah. His wife was killed. This took place in Namibia. His wife was killed. His father was killed. And his daughter. And they smashed his daughter's head against the wall. This is how she was killed. And he came to me and asked for prayers. And I was amazed at his stoicism at the time. But later on, I was talking to him in the car, and the people said to me, Father, you have to talk with this man because, we were told to forgive. The new government coming in says to forgive the faults that happened, and the man said he was never going to forgive. And he didn't care what this new government told them about forgiving. He was not going to forgive these people. And so I said to him, well, perhaps it really isn't what the government asks, but maybe it's what the Lord asks of us. Perhaps we can find it there. And his response to me was, perhaps the Lord did not experience what I experienced. I just was silent. But you see, in Whitehead, he would say to us, but he does. It's not just an intellectual knowing, but it's a whole feeling. He has taken it into himself. And it is part of that consequent nature, as we say, which develops, that God knows our suffering. He's not just the companion who walks along with us, but as the Christ who was broken, in a certain sense, that God experiences all that. And so he says to us, not just, I have an intellectual idea what it's like to have a broken leg. I feel that with you.
We would say that word absorb is a good one. God absorbs both the positive efforts of the world, but he also absorbs the suffering of the world.
He absorbs that futility almost that we feel, and yet says to us there's hope, and invites us out. Otherwise, I think without that, we would not go on. We would end. It is because God takes those into himself, even the negative, even the futile, or even the pain, and shows us that there can be life.
And he also opens doors to us. Very Whiteheadian notion here. In other words, Whitehead is supplying us with a hope in the face of this futility, because he's saying God suffers with us. He travels the path with us, and he is the agent who opens doors to us as we try to move into the future.
It's interesting because that's how Whitehead would look upon the resurrection. Cobb would, anyways.
Yeah, John Cobb being a process theologian who uses Whitehead's thought.
He would say, if you take Jesus just in his humanity, in responding always to the lure of God, that call of God to be more and more, Jesus always responds fully. And yet what that does is lead him into great suffering, into rejection, into futility almost. His life, as you look at it, would be a failure. And so yet, even as that happened and man has taken away his life, destroyed him, you would say, well, what door is open? It's over. And that's where God comes in with always novelty, with something new. And the option that comes is, but then there is newness of life, the resurrection. So in Whiteheadian theology or philosophy, if you want, that the resurrection is actually for Jesus and for us, the new opening ultimately to life.
It's the great model of what God does for us always and everywhere, right?
Precisely.
God, which is always to create new possibilities and invite us and give us strength to seize those new possibilities. I think we again, John, we see that in our own experiences, so that doesn't become sort of a vague speculation, but we can see that in our own experience. In other words, we are people who are limited in many ways by our physical capabilities, our previous decisions, our family background, the nation in which we grew up, the time and place in which we've been shaped. So we're limited. I mean, we're only so smart or so strong or learned this much to this point. So and Whitehead's very attuned to the limitations of life. But what he says is, and he says we have a freedom to mold and integrate that past into a new event. we have that root power. And so he talks about us having a subjective aim. He said we can choose to do something better. So someone whose marriage is in trouble can say, no, my aim now is to make this marriage better. And we've had a 15-year history where it hasn't gone well, and we've had our problems. I recognize that. But my aim, and now I want my spouse to get involved in this, is we're going to make this better. And now, once you do that, there's a great power in this freedom, because now we can work intelligently to try to actualize it. We can choose options. They can go get counseling from somebody. They can try to improve their communications. They can try to work together better on raising their children. They can get rid of some of the rough edges that bother their partner. There's so much they can do once they have that subjective aim and realize that their freedom gives them a chance to shape and mold and direct all of that givenness, all of that limitation, all that history that seems to drag them down. Mm-hmm. You can move forward on it.
Precisely. That's the most important aspect, I think, from our point of view, that it's never the end for us, never the end. And then also, as we look in relationship to God, when I look back at my past and I do see, I can find all kinds of reasons for guilt in my life, that I have to say, but God has taken that into himself, transforming that in a way. We would see that as God's forgivingness, and then showing us that we can still go beyond. And so we don't have to live with the past and saying, well, this is what has happened, this ends it, I am what I am. Because we can always say, but God calls us again. That God takes that and shows us, as you said, opens doors, or as Whitehead said, opens doors. Yeah. And so that is, to me, so important, that our spirituality, he calls you to a dynamic life, a dynamic spirituality, to be alive. In fact, that's what he says, we're pulsating.
Yes.
And so that he would say to you, no, don't ever let yourself say this is the end. Even when we look sometimes at our cities and say, is there any solution to the drug problem? Are we just going down? Are things just impossible? The call is that there is something you can do.
Sure.
That we are called to create. In fact, Whitehead uses that word. We are called to create the novel, as he would say. But it is the new.
And it's a very hope-filled vision, isn't it? It keeps saying you must work at all of this. One of the things, John, that I want to look at here is the way God does that. And what Whitehead is really big on saying that God uses loving persuasion with us rather than coercive power. And I think that's very good. In fact, he sees that exemplified in Jesus, who he called the gentle Galilean. When Whitehead read the New Testament, he looked at Jesus. That's how he saw him, as compassionate and gentle. I mean, we know there's another side to Jesus, a strong, rough side that throws the money changers out and says to the Pharisees, woe to you, and shape up and do it now. There's a harsher, more urgent side to Jesus. But Whitehead seemed to be attracted to the gentle Galilean because he represented for Whitehead the way he thought God deals with all of us through persuasion, a loving persuasion. In other words, it's like he's alluring us into this future. He's gently cajoling us to make progress. He's saying to us, don't give up. Look for the door that's open. And he wants to guide us gently to move into that. So he's always persuading us to create the new and then to not give up. And I think that's a very attractive image of God and a very comforting one, I believe.
Yeah, because I think it says to us that God will respect you. No matter where you are or how you perceive things to be, God is always the one who respects us as persons. And instead of coming in and forcing or by coercion, he simply respects who we are and invites us to be what we can be. And I think that's very much in keeping with the notion of John in the Gospel, God is love. And Jesus is saying 2 commandments, love one another. And so that's the whole sense of love. Can there be love without respect of who that other one is? Can there be love without inviting that person to be? Or do we make the person? And in Whitehead, his sense is that God respects us, so that although he's always there with, as they say, his lure. St. Francis de Sales uses an image very similar. He uses the magnet. says that we are like pieces of iron, and God draws us as a magnet draws iron to itself. And it's the whole sense, again, it is never force, that God doesn't force. It is always the alluring. And perhaps that's why I've been attracted, because Salesian spirituality has a certain sense of that dynamic process in it, which comes really maybe out of a Baroque sense.
So you're influenced by St. Francis de Sales, obviously, and there's a gentleness in that whole outlook, isn't there?
Right.
And
the sense of God as calling us into an intimacy, a friendship with Him. And so when I hear a great companion, that resonates with my call to intimacy or friendship, that loving God who wants to be part of us. And for Whitehead, that loving God is always part of us, even in our worst times, even in the most futile times, even in our most broken times.
And you use that word respect a lot. And one of the ways He respects us is to respect our freedom. In other words, God does not coerce us or force us to act in a certain way. He deals with us with respect. He respects our humanity and our freedom, and therefore uses a loving persuasion, or as you like to say, an allurement into a better future. And I think we experience that in our lives at times, feeling like we're lured, drawn into a better future, like we ought to create a better situation. I ought to try to get along with this guy at work. I mean, it doesn't make sense for us to just keep fighting. I'm lured into apologizing or saying, let's talk it over. Let's make it better here at work. Why should we keep hammering at each other? Maybe we could cooperate. So I think we feel that in family life and in our parishes, lured into greater involvement to make the parish be a better sign of Christ's presence in the world.
There's the other aspect of it, too, which is still hopeful, too. I believe it's that since God does respect us as a person, that means that decisions that we make do have consequences. So that if I become an alcoholic, for example, and I end up with a liver problem, God allows that in a sense, and yet says that here I am, who I am now with my broken health. He still calls me to be more. And yet I have to live sometimes with consequences. But I can be called beyond that. And I think sometimes we want to be like children and say, when I've done something, that it will no longer have an effect. But you see, in Whitehead philosophy, everything I do does have an effect. It's just that God will take those things which are negative and which are destructive and see that in this whole thing, nothing is final. That means that evil is not final. It has no finality. That it isn't forever. That it actually can be brought into the process and transformed. And so even in my life, if I find something in my life that I find has been destructive to myself, I can also know that somehow God will take that up within Himself, and it isn't final, and that it can eventually be transformed. Now, it will be different because of what I have decided in my life, that I am responsible, I do make a difference, but that God still works with that in itself isn't final.
That's well put, John. And I mean, it gives us great hope. I mean, even your mistakes, your sins are not final, because God will take that and offer new opportunities. Whitehead offers us a lot of different images of God that maybe are worth exploring here, that help fill out the picture. He talks about God as the harmony of harmonies. The one who wants to give us a sense of harmony. It's a God of peace, in a way, of God that says, no, get yourself together, get your head and heart together, be reconciled with people, with the world, be reconciled with me. So God is the harmony of all the other harmonies that are existing in the world, the one who pulls it all together and integrates everything. I sort of like that image.
I do too, because it's with the whole vision, the whole experience of the risen Lord in the Bible is always presented as, I give you peace, bring it together. That's what God comes to give us when He encounters us. That all that chaos, this unity, that goes back to that whole interrelatedness, that He wants to put us all together, for us to see that even though this person seems to be at odds with me, that there is an interrelationship between us, and there is a harmony that we can see in respecting each of us as individuals.
He also talks about God as a mirror. He says the mirror which discloses to every creature its own greatness. So God is our mirror who's telling us the goodness that's in our hearts and the potential we have. I like that. And then he talks about God as a poet, the poet of the world, who affirms the depths of reality and imagines what human existence can become. You notice it's always got that same flavor to it, doesn't it? Of newness, of novelty, of creativity, and so on.
I like that aspect, the idea of the poet imagining what we can be, because he picks up on where we are and says, but see, here is what it is. He always offers us that new thing. This is what you can be.
And Whitehead says that God is the fullness of beauty. He moves us through attraction rather than constraint. So I think Whitehead's often criticized for not having beautiful and great images of God, but they're different and worth pondering, I think. Think of God as a mirror and as a poet. And as you have emphasized so clearly in your own comments there, John, especially the great companion, the fellow sufferer who understands. That's a quote from Whitehead. The great companion, the fellow sufferer who understands. So, John, we've been looking at the problem of futility, like life is meaningless, we're not getting any place, and we're looking at Alfred North Whitehead, great philosopher, founder of process theology, who offers us some hope here. And he does it by telling us about the new and creativity. And he says we human beings are never just stuck in our failures and in our sins, but the great companion of life offers us a new future. He opens up a larger vista. He's the poet who suggests to us undreamed of possibilities. And that really is a great source of hope for all of us. Terrific.
Okay, well, thank you.
Marvelous, John. Marvelous. You got a great feel for them.
I think that's what it basically is.
Yes, you got a great feel for them. Wonderful. That's good. Can I buy you some lunch?
Well, I'll have a cup of coffee if I can somewhere.
Okay, let's go over to Spaghetti Warehouse.
Okay, that'd be great. Can I leave Dorothy Day here? Is she safe?
No, let's take them
Okay.
with us, and let me get Mark and tell him what our last program is. Alfred North Whitehead.
Hi.
We are finished, Mark, and our last one. Maybe I could pick up those things another.
Were these down like this?
I never touched them. Did we not get it?
Be on there if they were. It's safe. But I'm